Hello.
Hey, Fabian.
Happy Wednesday.
Thank you. All right. It's one past, so we'll start. Welcome everyone to the AMA of the Sharding Group. My name is Fabian Zimmer. I'm a group product manager in enablement. We have quite a few members of the Sharding Group available here as well to answer all of the questions that you may have. The goal of this AMA is to increase transparency with regards to our own activities, to ensure that folks understand why we are doing what we're doing, and also illustrate and explain the impact if specific areas have questions. And we have two questions in the doc. What I'm going to do is at least vocalize the first one, then we'll see if there are more questions. There is a slide deck that actually provides an overview of our current favored strategy for scaling our database, which is decomposition. And we'll see how it goes. If folks have specific questions, we'll do that. Otherwise, I may go through some slides and provide more context. Okay, so the first question is from Kenny. And he asks, where could we read more about the plan for decomposition? What work is required? When it's expected to be completed? How will it be rolled out? And there's a single epic, 6168. I linked it here, I also put it to the links. That is the entry point for all of the work that is being done by the Sharding Group right now. It also has linked work items. So when we expect completion, we are currently operating under the assumption that we can roll this out into production by the end of this financial year, so end of January. The details of the rollout plan are still being discussed. It's a large change, so there's a lot of considerations. We don't want to make these risky changes and causing any outages or availability concerns at GitLab.com. So it's a delicate matter. And as an example, there is also there are work epics for specific sections. So for example, dev or ops, where the work is being tracked for issues that are being found out. So go check that out. It's all in the epic tree. And then the second question from Nathan. Are you here to vocalize your question?
Yes, I am. Regarding the slide number 2, do we know how much on infrastructure we spend per paying users versus free tier users?
I personally don't know in detail. Is anybody in the Sharding Group here who has a detailed understanding of that? Otherwise, I'll give you a high level.
I don't know either, Nathan, sorry.
Okay.
It's something we can follow up on and find out though.
Yeah, we'll follow up. I can give you a high level understanding that I have, and I'll follow up with Andrew Thomas, who's the infrastructure product manager. So I know that a significant amount of infrastructure spend is actually attributed to our Git storage. That Git storage uses disks, SSDs, which is very expensive. And a significant proportion of the Git data is actually created by free users. So at least for that, I know that free tier users are likely a driving factor of at least some aspects of that cost. For others, like CI, for example, it may vary because we may have some very active CI users that are paid customers. But that's out of the top of my head.
Thank you.
I have the next question. This is for the lay person, potentially. Is sharding or decomposition a project, or is this a new ongoing approach? It's the first time I've seen the word in print when I got invited to the AMA.
So my answer to that is like, we identify this like as the best way to move forward to buy immediate headroom, like 4 to 10x. This is what we are kind of estimating on the decomposition. And really depending on the outcome of these projects, we may decompose another aspect, or we may consider sharding this aspect, because what we are right now doing is really like the first step on the approach to improve like the scalability of the GitLab. I mean, overall, like we are heading into more horizontal scalability of the GitLab, but in order to get to that point, we need to have like some contained complexity of existing components to figure out what is the best way to approach it. So there is like some ongoing work on sharding blueprint that tries to figure out and describe like where the composition and sharding is on the spectrum of the database scalability work that may answer some of your questions. Whether this is one-off thing or more like a pattern that we may want to implement into the future.
Got it.
Does it answer your question?
Partially. So let me ask it a different way. Can the word sharding, can it become a past tense? Like, great news, we went through this and we sharded GitLab. It was a tremendous project and a great success, and it was a significant effort to get us ready. And now we don't have to do it again. Or is it from now on in perpetuity, we will either choose one of these and it'll just be the way we design and develop the product? So if I could just rephrase my own question, does that help?
Can you go ahead?
Yes, please, Fabian. Do you want to answer?
That's a great question. So I think you touched on something really important here. Ultimately, what we are concerned with is scaling GitLab based on our growth. And so we are evaluating several strategies on how we can scale GitLab, and sharding or decomposition are strategies to address the scalability of our database. So with what we're doing right now, which is essentially we are focusing on a set of tables for our continuous integration, we're going to move them somewhere else. There is an end date to that. We can speak of that in the past tense at some point and say, we've done this, right? We've accomplished our goal here. And at that point, we can evaluate again or do it in parallel and say like, okay, do we want to take another part of our product and do the same thing over again? Or do we need to think about sharding, which is essentially saying we select a namespace, for example. So something that you can loosely corresponds to a customer, and we start horizontally fanning that out. And that will also have an end date, but it is a continuous sort of process of figuring out what the next thing is that we need to do in order for us to provide scalability. The fun thing about some of these strategies, like sharding, is once you've done it, right, and you've sharded by namespace, if you add new customers, for example, you can do that for a very long time and scale. So it may get us to 100x. Whereas if you decompose, CI is a very significant part of our rights to the database. So once we move that somewhere else, that's kind of done. We can't do that again for the next CI because we only have so many functions. So those are the trade-offs that we're considering. But for decomposition, there's a clear sort of start and end date to it. but we definitely hope there's an end date to it where we can say, yes, we've done it. Does that help?
Yes, helps a bunch. Thank you. Brendan, I think you're up.
Yeah, so I was asking how the two interrelate, right? How will decomposition impact? I know we've been talking about sharding for a long time, probably ever since I've been here, which is 4 years. And I knew of the issue with the CI table growth. This is the first I heard of decomposition. So kind of like Tim, not the first I heard of sharding, but the first I heard of decomposition. So I was wondering how the two things will impact each other in the future, and if we expect like our self-serve customers, self-managed customers to use either or both decomposition or sharding in the future.
So we don't know about the sharding architecture and like what it's gonna be looking like in the future. For example, in the presentation of Fabian, you could read that we may use application level sharding, like a horizontal, or we may want to use some database technology like a Vitess or maybe Citus. It's usually pretty heavy stack. We like to run these sharded, horizontally scaled databases. So I cannot answer what is the future. I can answer how we see the composition. The composition uses exactly everything that your Omnibus uses today. So it's from the installation perspective, what we want this to look like. You already have Postgres server. We can just split that into two logical databases that already gives you like this separation, that if you overgrow your single Postgres server, you can simply move this another logical database into separate server, and this way kind of pretty easily scale out your existing GitLab installation. So for vanilla installs, the simple installs, like we will just provision two logical databases on the same Postgres server. That already allows you to scale out fairly easy to have significantly more headroom into the future. But from our perspective, it makes it aligned with how you run it on gitlab.com. But also, like by design, it will be more performant because of the concerns separation and the complexity separation and dataset separation. So that's really like our idea behind running on-premise. We want on-premise be as close to gitlab.com. We don't use any custom Postgres today. So we don't really have this kind of like problem of running the compose CI on-premise installation. It's more like a way to figure out like how we want to migrate existing installations over some period of time to make it actually be executed on theirs. Brendan,
Yes.
does it answer your question?
It does. I much like Tim also have a follow-up though. And I was typing it as you were finishing up, Camille, thank you. Is there any advantage to the two logical databases beyond like the scale issue of number of records that we're seeing in CI? Like, would a self-managed customer have a reason to separate those logical databases into servers, do you see, unless they had, what we have, which is hundreds of thousands of users and millions and millions of job minutes a day? Is that the scale where it makes sense, or is there some other reason you might want to do that?
That's a very interesting question. Today, CI versus the rest is like 1/3 of the data store, about half of the writes. So as by splitting like this main versus CI, we are kind of mostly splitting our database in half. So as you can see, as for gitlab.com, we can take very long way till we need to run two different databases, to be honest. If our customers will need that, I don't know, really. It really depends like about the workflow. If they trigger, let's say, 10 million builds a day, it may impact the performance of the rest of the system, and it may be more desirable for them to split. So the answer is not conclusive, but it's there.
Yeah. So I think the summary for me here is that I think right now this is primarily something that is really important for our scalability at the level of .com, but having isolation can be helpful in some instances as well. Does that answer your questions, Brandon?
It does. Thank you.
Cool.
And I think
Mark.
Craig just added a note in there with another link, and then Mark, you're up next.
Okay, great. Thanks, Brendan. You mentioned Slack on slide 10, and you said it took 3+ years. I just started reading the blog. Is this the expectation for GitLab? And have we learned anything from what Slack did to help?
That's a great question. So Slack did actually something that else, which is using a different database technology called Vitess, which uses MySQL, and then moved to a system where Slack is essentially sharding its database by customers. So it's a horizontal approach. It's not decomposition, but that may be in our future. So we are actually looking at Vitess, for example, as a potential future strategy to get us, to 100x. I think the main learning here is that this is not an easy feat, and we have to be very mindful on going down that path. And maybe there are simpler things that we can do to avoid going on a multi-year journey. So for one thing, for example, and that's important to note, is that Vitess exists and uses MySQL. We don't. We use Postgres, and Vitess does not support Postgres. So that immediately leads to questions like, okay, so given that no such system like Vitess exists, should we maybe think about adding Postgres support to Vitess? That's a really big thing. And those considerations. So it's mainly, I think, for me at least, a reminder that some of these things take a long time, and it's worth evaluating the options when you want to go forward. Right now, I think we're in a spot where we have to make smaller iterations because we need to move forward. If we take 3 years to scale our database, we are out of room in shorter than that. So it's not really an option. So it factored in for us to say, hey, we may want to do this, but we need something that helps us in the short term, that is more iterative.
Thanks.
I took Mark's question a little bit more literally, about 3 years. So for this project, for what we originally focused this AMA on was decomposition, and we expect that to take 6 months, give or take, and this, especially on the give or take part. So that'll buy us, we think, 4 to 10x headroom on the database, and buy us some more time so that we can look at sharding for the 100x future scale, as Fabian mentioned.
Maybe adding another question, doing any sharding technology, we were trying that for some time, I think since 2 years or even more, trying if there is some database sharding technology that we could use. And in the monolithic, highly tangled set of the data set, it's proven to be super hard thing really to get right. With the sharding and the horizontal scaling of, let's say, sharding by customers or some other factors, we did discover that we would have to clone a lot of the current database. It's with all the and figuring out all of these queries, how they would behave crossing different physical servers, and this alone kind of sparked us that it's a multi-year project to get it right, and it's more almost all or nothing to some extent. So we were trying to find something that is significantly simple, that move us into the direction of much better scaling of the application, and move us closer into sharding by simply making our problem of sharding significantly smaller, because now with the decomposition of the CI, if we then want to shard the CI part only with Vitess or some other technology, instead of looking at 600 tables, we are looking only at 30 tables, how to best distribute them across many database servers. So this, even like by thinking about the relation between these tables, is making this problem much more easier, even like to map in your head. So the composition is really like a way to break the complexities and prepare the application to something more sophisticated in the future. And we are kind of finding what is this so sophisticated. What's like that with these 3 years, it's they kind of move completely opposite, because they prior to this sharding strategy, they had a customer per single database, and this was proving limiting their product on what features that can do. So they kind of do something reverse what we are doing. They kind of join all of their customers into single database that is sharded, and they pretty much rewritten most of the data access layer to migrate from transparently from like customer per database into many customers per fully horizontally sharded application. And that's why it took them 3 years, because they actually did that like gracefully migrating customers over like a longer period and ensuring that these features continue to work while they are doing that. If you would have to do it like sharding the whole GitLab, I would not. I think 3 years can be accurate or optimistic if you consider us like as a whole project like a moving target that you have constantly teams adding new features on which you need to kind of like fix while you are doing this project. So these 3 years is basically due to the complexity of the project of they were trying to execute and doing that completely transparently to the customers, even though they were doing something completely opposite. But I think if you would map that on GitLab, it would probably be fairly the same as for the complexity.
All right, thank you, Camille. Are there any further questions right now? Super. I have a few finishing words. I think something that is important to note for folks here in the room is that scaling our database is a great problem to have. It is a consequence of our growth. So it's hard, but also exciting. But it is also only a part of what we need to do as a company. So this is a strategy to buy us time and headspace, but there are many other things that also need to happen. So the working group for database scalability is also working on defining blueprints and best practices for our developers so that they can utilize functionalities that allow us to scale better. So a good example of this is time decay. So if we are accumulating, for example, log data that we only need to keep for 3 months, then we can drop it after that time. And that allows us to scale a lot better than storing that data for years and bloating tables. So I think that's an important thing to consider, that decomposition and later on sharding is a really important part of scalability, but there are many other things that we also need to do. And those are parallel tracks. And that's also exciting because there's still, I think, a lot of room in the system for those kinds of improvements. So I'm very positive about that. And then lastly, oh yeah, from Camille, he has a comment on this that I think puts this into perspective.
No, I think like I agree with you. Like the best data is simply no data. If you can drop that data, retain, like recycle that. I think this is very good pattern. Very often, like till that point, we were kind of trying very hard to retain everything forever, but like it's not feasible. There is like finite amount of atoms in the universe to store your data. So we may want to be concerned about that.
Yeah. Thank you. I think lastly, I really appreciate all of your time. We are available in the Slack channel that I posted in here. If you ever have any questions or you don't get something, or you are concerned, or you don't know how your team is impacted or how your customers are impacted, please reach out. We are available and happy to help. And I believe we are also pretty much at time, at least GitLab time. I'll look to official timekeeper Craig, is that correct?
Yep.
So thank you very much and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks.